Hello, I'm Olivia Beldwicks, and today I'm going to be teaching you about Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a former First Lady who gave ladies a voice. She's most famously known for being a former First Lady, as she was wife to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. She was the First Lady for the longest time yet, as she was married for quite a bit as her husband was president. She was also a humanitarian who fought for equal rights for so many individuals, which included women, immigrants, children, and African Americans. She was born October 11th in 1884 in New York City, but she grew up in Tivoli, New York with her grandmother. She was born into a wealthy political family. Her uncle was President Theodore Roosevelt. However, her father was an alcoholic and narcotic addict, as well as having stress sickness, I think they coined it. Her parents and older brother, they all died by the time she was 10, and she remembered that her father told her before she passed that she was to take care of her younger brother. So while she was 9, she was already put into a parent role. Her grandmother was supposedly stoic and very critical of Eleanor, and that left her with really low self-esteem, and she was kind of submissive. She wouldn't talk too much. She wasn't raising her voice or anything. And she was always said to be shy, for she thought she wasn't as good as other girls. That changed, though, for as a teenager, she studied at Allenswood Girls Academy, and she met her teacher, Marie Silvestre, who became her mentor and her guide, as Eleanor claimed. Silvestre was passionate about social and political issues, and she encouraged students to speak up about them. She was a French immigrant herself. She taught the girls basic education, and women's education at the time didn't include history, geography, or philosophy. However, she did encourage those women to educate themselves, especially on those topics, so that they can be on an equal playing field with men. And during summer vacations, she would bring Eleanor to Italy and France, and instead of just showing her the tourist sites, she would also expose her to impoverished people and the working class, so she knew how people around the world were living, as well as outside of her own class. Her early adulthood. Out of school, Silvestre kind of left her with this newfound confidence, and she was eager to make social change. She began her social work by teaching immigrant children at the Rivington Street Settlement House. This helped them learn basic skills and trades, and also just educate them where they wouldn't otherwise afford an education like Eleanor was able to. In her early 20s, she was a secretary for the Junior League, and that aimed to better the conditions for the working class and help new immigrants learn skills that would better their chances in the U.S. In her spare time, she was a volunteer investigator for a tenement house. She would visit those sweatshops where lower classes would work and live, and then she would report the conditions, which were often very ghastly. They weren't good conditions. She spoke with people there, and she interviewed them, and then she would write down the interviews in articles, newspapers, or just in her reports, and she learned how little they were getting paid, or sometimes they would work overtime and not get paid. The physical workload was too much for them, and they barely got any hours off. They would always be working, and a lot of the people working there were younger than 16. She also helped create the Consumer's White Label, which was something that had to be put on any products that were made, where the companies and the workers were put in these unethical, unfair conditions, so that it exposed them a little bit, so maybe hopefully people wouldn't buy those products. She also helped solidify child labor laws and immigrant protection policies by reporting these conditions. Yeah. And then she got married. In 1905, she married her fifth cousin, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and they had 6 children together. Her mother-in-law was said to be very critical and skeptical, just like her grandmother was, and it kind of made her conform into the gender role of a woman at the time. She was supposed to stay at home and watch the kids and not have a voice in politics and not do all the social work and the volunteer work that she was doing. And so she did stay out of the public eye for a lot of years while her husband was into politics, and he was trying to be governor and then eventually president. But later her husband Franklin admitted to having an affair, and that kind of led Eleanor to be a little bit more independent. She became active in volunteering again and would even go live in her own home in New York, which was very taboo at the time. Usually a family would all stay together. There would be the nuclear family, but she would actually leave and go stay away and have her time alone, but she would return for the family. When World War I came, she would go take the initiative to volunteer at the American Red Cross and help in different Navy hospitals, since her husband was very into the Navy. But later he was diagnosed with polio, and so she had the role of actually keeping in his public eye, but also, I guess, keeping up with the maternal roles as well, so she had to play both the husband and the wife. But she soon hired Missy Leehand to help with her husband as his medical condition worsened. But she also did a lot of the wifely duties. She would help clean up the house. She would hold the social gatherings. And so Eleanor was able to focus on other things. She joined the League of Women Voters, the Women's Trade Union League, and worked for the Women's Division of New York State Democratic Committee. Along with that, she helped create Valkill, which was her nonprofit furniture factory, and she taught a private girls' school, all while still being a good wife. She did a lot of work for women's rights and women's liberation and equal rights. She was the first lady who held her own press conference. Usually it was just the president who was able to give the first political press conference, but she figured she had the schooling, she had the education, and she had the life experience to have a say. So she made her press conference as well, and she had equal time as her husband did, and she only allowed female reporters to be there so that they got a platform to report as well as the men. She was on the board for, and she was eventually the vice president for the Women's City Club of New York, which was adamant on educating women about political issues. It also kept its members in contact with other professional women so they could have role models and they could collaborate eventually. She was a member of the Women's Trade Union League from 1922 to 1955. This league worked in the settlement movement, and it gave a voice to women labor leaders. It also helped trade unions accept more women laborers because women weren't seen as equal and they weren't allowed to work in the same places that men could work, including labor unions. She was also the vice chair of the New York State League, which allowed women into political processes on state and national electing, and it informed them on their candidates. So it gave women a little bit more information about who they were voting for so that hopefully they could vote someone that would eventually give women a little bit more rights. She also worked with the Civilian Conservation Corps, which hired young workers to work in forestry, which was previously only allowed for men, but she was successful in allowing it to be a woman's playing field as well. She was in the chair of John F. Kennedy's Commission of the Status of Women, which later revealed huge studies on gender and gender discrimination. Sadly, those studies came out after she died, but she was still able to, have a say in making that happen. Women in Politics was her radio show on NBC Radio. She provided information on politics, social issues, and other influential women, so hopefully women could turn that on and they could hear about these other women that weren't in their history books or aren't really in newspaper articles, and she would write about them so that they can have a role model and they can be in the know of women doing these great causes. She also wrote a column in Women's Home Companion, which allowed women a platform to write in their struggles and questions. She wrote over 3,000 articles, gave hundreds of speeches, and wrote 6 books. She was also big in human rights other than women's rights. She was known as the First Lady of the World for her work with the United Nations, which aimed for peace between its countries and its people. There was a society called the Daughters of the American Revolution, which claimed to be a feminist society, yet they refused singer Marian Anderson the right to perform at their auditorium simply because she was African American. Roosevelt resigned her membership to that, boycotted going to their auditorium, and 2 months later she had Anderson sing in the White House for the King and Queen of England, kind of as a take that to the Daughters of American Revolution. She had a column called My Day, which advocated for the rights of minorities, lower class, and otherwise disadvantaged people. She wrote in that every workday from 1935 until her death. She also testified for the New York state legislature to give shorter hours for children and women taking care of children. So although, people that were under 16 were still allowed to work at the time, she started building the stepping stones to, okay, have them work less, have them more educated. She was known as her husband's legs, eyes, and ears because she would go and inspect orphanages, schools, hospitals, hospices, nursing homes, and other state-supported facilities when her husband wasn't able to go, and she would report them back to her husband as he was president, and he would make bills and policies for those places to clean their act up a little bit more. During the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, Roosevelt spoke against segregation laws. She even moved her chair to the middle of the partition where the whites and the colors were separated so that she could show that she didn't care if they were equal in her eyes. She even would kiss her African American colleagues on the cheeks just as she would her Caucasian colleagues, which at the time was very taboo. You weren't supposed to, or it wasn't seen, so she kind of made a good example in doing that. She also wanted a photograph of her with her 2 African American guards at Howard University taken. This was taboo because white political figures weren't really allowed to take pictures with African Americans, but she was adamant about taking it, and she posted it everywhere, and that's the picture in the corner there. She also supported the Association of Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching, and she was the co-creator for the National Youth Administration, which is similar to today's student financial aid. It gave grants to students who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford school and allowed them a work-study program where they were allowed to work part-time and then get job training and go to school off of that. So her husband died in 1945, but she lived on and lived out his legacy. She did this by being appointed in 1946. She served for more than a decade as a delegate to the United Nations, and it was the institution established by her husband, and she embraced the cause for world peace. After his death, she also continued working for her nonprofit company, but she later died in 1962 at the age of 78. She's still known to be one of the most influential people in history, influential women in history especially, and I chose her for that. I chose her for those little acts that she did where she would put the chair in the middle of the rows between men and women. She had her women's only press conference, and she insisted that her speech ran just as long as her husband's. She did so many groundbreaking activities like that where she can show that men and women were equal, that women and young people can be educated, women and African American people. She kind of broke the boundaries between people where they were so segregated and kept in different expectations, and she made it so that they all have an opportunity, and that's why I really liked her story. She was perceived at her time kind of good, kind of bad. For a lot of people, it was very shocking to see a first lady that was so outspoken, which is why I think in the beginning she was kind of more of a wifely figure, and she stayed in the house and she did the social parties, but eventually she decided that she needed to speak up for her own good and for her husband who was sick, and I really appreciated that about her. And a lot of women at the time really appreciated that about her, and she wrote so much, and she got so many letters in saying, how can I help, or thank you so much for being a woman who is helping and is giving a voice, and she was such a positive role model for a lot of those women, although a lot of other women didn't like that and didn't like the way everything was going. But now she is known for a groundbreaker and a path setter for the modern generation and where we're going in the future with hopefully even more equality between the genders. And last but not least, my references. So I hope you enjoyed this, and thank you very much.